Okay, so in this EdPuzzle, we're going to pick up where we left off last time, talking about nutrition, specifically looking at cofactors that are important in the function of a lot of different kinds of proteins, so things that are inorganic components that we need to get from our diet. Also looking at the difference between malnutrition and undernutrition, because there's a big difference there, actually. And then we'll move on to talking about what is in blood, and particularly how our bodies deal with damage to our blood vessels. Okay, so like we were talking about last time, we talked about vitamins, and vitamins, of course, being those essential components that we need. They're, again, lots of times coenzymes. They're involved in the support of a lot of different kinds of systems, but many of them are involved in support of cellular respiration, right? So we saw that a lot of the vitamins, for example, B vitamins, are components to our electron shuttles, or other proteins involved in the electron transport chain. And so consequently, when you have a deficiency of a particular vitamin, B vitamins, for example, you might be feeling sluggish or tired. You might have trouble healing because your cells are not getting enough energy to run mitosis and so on. So minerals are essentially a similar thing, but of course they're inorganic, right? So vitamins are organic, meaning they have carbon. Minerals are inorganic. And again, a lot of these are our trace elements that we were talking about at the beginning of the course. Again, try not to, you don't have to necessarily memorize this whole table, but a few good take-home messages. These are the main minerals. Again, we have lots of others, as you see at the bottom, that are, again, required in very small amounts, but have really important functions. Many of them are support of our immune system. A lot of the other minerals on the table here, you'll notice the ones that are in the bracket here, calcium down to magnesium. Those are all considered our electrolytes. And you'll notice the major function in the body, most of them, in addition to components to amino acids and in some cases bone and tooth formation, but many of the others you'll notice nerve function, osmotic balance, nerve function. So the deficiencies in those can of course lead to problems with your nerve function, and of course our nerves are telling our muscles when they're supposed to contract. And so if you're not able to do that properly, then you may see a muscle weakness or paralysis or cramping as a result of a lack of a particular electrolyte. And this will make more sense when we get to the nervous system, when we look at exactly how nerves send electrical impulses. In particular, the ions that are important in that are potassium, chlorine, sodium, and to a lesser degree, calcium. So all of those things are extremely important for our nervous system function. And so you want to make sure you maintain your electrolyte balance. So again, advice, for example, if you've been working out a lot and sweating a lot, obviously you want to replace the water that you've lost, but you'll also have secreted in sweat a lot of your salts. And again, a lot of those are your electrolytes. So drinking something like, Pedialyte or Gatorade or something like that can be recommended, or eating a salty snack also will help replace those lost nutrients, those lost minerals. Others that we can see on the table, right? Iron, fluorine, and iodine. Others that we need in decent amounts, especially if you have iron deficiency anemia. You might have to take an iron supplement to make sure that you're getting enough of that particular cofactor, which we know again is very important in the formation of hemoglobin and its functional structure in transporting oxygen. So again, if you don't have enough iron, your body can't make enough hemoglobin, which means you're going to be having trouble transporting oxygen. And of course, oxygen is the necessary component for your electron transport chain because you need a final electron acceptor for that. So malnutrition essentially is caused by an insufficiency in a particular nutrient. It's usually a specific one. It could be more than one, but in general, it's just one that you're missing of those essential vitamins or minerals, right? So as you are missing one of those, of course, you're going to have symptoms of a particular deficiency. So, for example, scurvy, this causes skin lesions, among other problems, is a result of not having enough vitamin C in your diet. Other consequences may be even more severe. So something like rickets, especially in children, is the result of not having enough vitamin D in your diet, and so your bones don't form correctly and they bow out. Another birth defect associated with a particular deficiency is spina bifida. And this results when your neural tube during early embryonic development doesn't close like it's supposed to. So as we know, this happens fairly early in embryonic development and as a result of a deficiency in folic acid, which is one of our B vitamins. So this is, of course, why, for example, folks advise women who are thinking about becoming pregnant or may become pregnant to be taking prenatal vitamins. And part of that is an extra boost in your folic acid consumption, or at the very least, just taking extra folic acid. Pantothenic acid is another B vitamin that's important in early neurological development. And so those are, you see those elevated levels of those particular nutrients in prenatal vitamins for that reason. Undernutrition, on the other hand, is basically your failure to provide your body with sufficient fuel for metabolism. So a lot of times when we say malnutrition, what we're actually referring to is undernutrition. So you may have the essential nutrients, but you're not giving your body enough fuel to burn for metabolism to maintain itself. And of course, we know, especially as mammals, we are maintaining our internal body heat as a result of metabolic activity. So we have much higher metabolic rate than some other organisms. A lot of the food that we consume, we break that down and use it to rebuild our own cells, but we're also using all that fuel to run, basically just to maintain our body, just to keep it going. There's a lot of energy and fuel energy that's required just to keep our bodies going in general. So if you are suffering from undernutrition, quite often, again, you're not getting enough fuel from the food that you're eating, and so your body starts to break itself down. And ironically, what we go to first after you burn through your initial sort of stash of glycogen is going to protein. You don't break down the lipids first. Your body breaks down protein first. And so this essentially means your muscles start to atrophy and you have loss of muscle mass as a result of undernutrition. In really extreme cases, this is something we see in folks who have been in a concentration camp, for example, and they have basically their body has metabolized itself in order to continue to function, to stay alive. This is something that the processing of large amounts of protein results in extra waste products associated with protein metabolism. So additional uric acid and creatinine and some other byproducts, waste products, which are damaging, in particular to your kidneys in higher levels. And so that damage actually may be permanent as a result of chronic undernutrition. So short-term undernutrition is not so bad, but chronic undernutrition can result in permanent damage to organs, in particular your kidneys. And that's something that you may have to just live with for the rest of your life, or in some cases, in extreme cases, long-term deprivation of your body of the nutrients that it needs just to survive, just the fuel that it needs to function, of course, can result in death. So again, extreme forms of this would be the eating disorder, anorexia, in extreme cases. can result in death because you have deprived your body of the basically just the fuel that it needs, and it's broken itself down to such a point that it just your body can no longer function. So if anyone's familiar with that at all, or if you know someone who suffers from this eating disorder, trying to get them some professional help with that is really, really important because it's something that you certainly can deal with and overcome with some help and assistance with that. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Carpenters. So it was a singing songwriting group in the 70s. It was a brother-sister group, and Karen Carpenter ended up dying from anorexia. So she's probably one of the most famous people that ended up battling this particular disease, and unfortunately, lost her battle there, which is terribly tragic and sad. So just long-term deprivation of your body of the fuel that it needs is also extremely damaging. Okay, so changing gears a little bit, we're going to be looking at the respiratory system and the circulatory system. So there's another EdPuzzle that deals with circulation, predominantly your heart, arteries, veins, capillaries, etc. And here we're going to start by looking at blood. Blood, of course, major component of blood, of course, are our red blood cells. And our red blood cells contain hemoglobin, and hemoglobin, of course, is our transport protein for oxygen. So that's how that feeds back into our respiratory system. So what's in blood? And blood, as we talked about earlier, is a connective tissue. It's a type of connective tissue. In this case, we have cells that are suspended in a thick liquid. The liquid, of course, is going to be based mainly on water, but there's a lot of other stuff in there, as we're going to see on the next slide. Take a look at what's in blood, in particular what's in plasma, a little bit more closely. But if you were to sort blood by volume, a little bit less than half are cells. Red blood cells, also known as erythrocytes, and leukocytes, also known as white blood cells. We're going to talk about these more later on when we talk about the immune system. Other large portion of the volume are platelets. And we'll be getting into what platelets are and what they do and in here in just a second. But for now, let's focus on red blood cells, or erythrocytes. As I mentioned, these guys contain a large amount of hemoglobin. And the hemoglobin molecules, of course, are able to carry up to 4 oxygen molecules at a time. So the main function of red blood cells really is oxygen transport. Their shape increases their surface area, and as we've been talking about, right, form and function, where you have lots of surface area, you have lots of potential for diffusion to happen. And of course, if your job is transport, in this particular case, of a gas, so that's really important for it to go diffuse from high concentration to low concentration. We have no way of really speeding up that process too much other than increasing the amount of erythrocytes and increasing the amount of hemoglobin that we have in our blood to increase our ability to transport oxygen from one part of the body to the other. Fun facts about our red blood cells. As we were talking about when we talked about the forensics section, red blood cells actually have no nucleus. So they are not a good source of nuclear DNA. They don't have mitochondria either. They basically accomplish all of their cellular processes using anaerobic pathways, so basically glycolysis and lactic acid fermentation in our case. And this is mainly to increase the space for hemoglobin. So basically our red blood cells are stuffed full of hemoglobin molecules. And of course, as I mentioned, every hemoglobin molecule can bind up to 4 oxygen molecules. So you've got probably billions of hemoglobin molecules, or anyway, a very large amount in your red blood cells. And you have about 25 trillion red blood cells in your body at any given point. So that's a lot of potential for oxygen transfer. That's a main job of red blood cells, which again takes up between red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets about half of your blood volume. So if you were to stick some blood in a centrifuge and spin it around a bunch of times, right, like you guys were doing in lab at various points, of course, you notice the heavier things will sink to the bottom, right? So you're going to get a pellet of cells at the bottom of your test tube. And that's, again, going to be predominantly red blood cells or erythrocytes, right? Platelets, which, again, are really important in blood clotting, which we're going to talk about here in just a second. And different types of white blood cells. We're going to skip different types, some of these types later on. We will talk about neutrophils and lymphocytes in particular. There are lots of other kinds of white blood cells out there, but those are, again, mainly involved in our immune system and defending us from pathogens, so bacteria, fungi, or viruses. And then you'll have that, basically that little nugget at the bottom there, which is most of the cells. And then you have the plasma floating on top. And again, this is the liquid portion of your blood. So of course, water is the solvent, but you've got a whole bunch of stuff dissolved in there, right? You've got glucose, you've got hydrophilic vitamins, other types of hydrophilic molecules, some proteins, hormones, a bunch of other stuff in there, right? Immunoglobulins, aka antibodies, right? These are, again, very important components of our immune system. And then we have other dissolved proteins like fibrinogen, which is involved in blood clotting. You'll also notice in the top part here where it says ions, blood electrolytes, right? So those are those trace minerals, right, that are in ion form, that are really important in maintaining our osmotic balance, right? So that, again, has to go back to that whole hypertonic, hypotonic thing, in which way water moves, right? We don't need our red blood cells swelling and bursting. We don't need our red blood cells shriveling up like little raisins, right? So we have to maintain our osmotic balance in our blood in order for not only our red blood cells to function properly, but of course all of our other molecules that are being carried in our blood to do their jobs the way that they're supposed to, as well as any other cells like our immune cells to function properly. You'll also notice in the bottom of that list, right, it says calcium, magnesium chloride, and bicarbonate. So hopefully everybody remembers what bicarbonate's job is. Right? It's the conjugate base of carbonic acid, right? So again, this is our blood buffer, and it helps maintain your pH balance. And we're going to see later on how important maintaining that balance is to the function of hemoglobin itself. So your blood plasma is full of all of this good stuff, right? So nutrients, dissolved, amino acids, all those building blocks, right? Your organic components, like your vitamins, right? Minerals, dissolved gases, antibodies, ions, which of course, again, play a really critical role in our osmotic balance, basically how water is going to move into and out of cells, and particularly between cells, right? So interstitial fluid is basically just the fluid between cells, right? So we're animals, so we don't have cell walls. So in between our cells is all of that connective tissue, right? Those collagen fibers, that extracellular matrix that we talked about earlier in the course. And then there's just a lot of fluid in between. And again, water is going to be the base, but there's a lot of other stuff dissolved in that fluid, right? Nutrients, hormones, other kinds of signaling molecules, vitamins, dissolved gases, buffers, all that stuff is in there, right? It's kind of sloshing around. And then, of course, we have fluid that's confined to our blood vessels, which, of course, is our blood. And again, the big liquid component to that is our plasma. Also in plasma, of course, metabolic wastes. We're going to talk about that later when we talk about excretion. We're generally talking about getting rid of those metabolic wastes. So those are those toxic byproducts of breaking down proteins and nucleic acids and other things. So another thing, as we mentioned earlier in the last slide, what's contained in your blood plasma are what are called clotting factors. These are dissolved proteins that are usually in their inactive form. And so in their inactive form, they are basically dissolved in that hydrophilic liquid matrix. Also floating around in your blood, of course, are platelets. So platelets are fragments of cytoplasm of bone marrow cells. So these are the cells that are in charge of making red blood cells, our erythrocytes, as well as our leukocytes. So these are essentially are fragments of those cells that are floating around in your blood. Again, as they're cytoplasm fragments, they don't have any nuclei, and so you have those dissolved in your blood as well. Clotting factors are, many of them are proteins, but we also have some that are other kinds of organic molecules, including vitamin K, as we're going to see here in the next slide. So the reason we're talking about this is, of course, talking about what happens when your blood vessels are damaged, meaning you either have, well, hopefully not a crushing injury, but it could be that, or some sort of a cut in the lining of your blood vessel. Basically, your blood vessels are broken, and you have blood leaking out, either outside of your body or at least outside of the vessel, right? This could be something that's a bruise, for example, as a result of broken blood vessels. So the broken blood vessels, there are, of course, cells that are lining your blood vessels and are part of that. And they are essentially secreting chemical signals that are essentially saying, help. I'm broken, help. And part of that call for help, platelets are attracted to those chemical signals. And then the platelets are essentially activated. They release some additional chemicals, and that starts the process of coagulation. And so coagulation is basically converting those liquid components, those liquid clotting factors, into a solid, insoluble component called a clot. So those liquid components basically are converted from their inactive form to their active form. In their active form, they wrap around the platelets and red blood cells and other stuff to form this solid mass that essentially plugs the hole, right? So you have no more blood leaking outside of the blood vessel. So blood clot formation is a really good example of a positive feedback loop, right? So we're talking about homeostasis. We talk about negative feedback, meaning that the response to the stimulus essentially eliminates the stimulus, right? So if your body is overheating, you start sweating. Sweating cools you down, which causes your body temperature to go down, right? And that means that you're no longer overheating, and therefore your temperature is back where it should be. Clot formation involves positive feedback. So essentially you have an amplification of the stimulus leads to an amplification of the response, or sorry, the response leads to an amplification of the stimulus. So basically you lead to an even bigger response. So in this particular case, right, we have damaged cells that are sending out those help distress calls basically to the platelets in particular, but also they will trigger the release of clotting factors in your plasma as well. So as we can see on the drawing, right, we've got clotting factors are being released by platelets, again in response to signals from those damaged cells. Some clotting factors are released by the damaged cells themselves, and some, of course, are carried in the plasma already, including things like vitamin K. So these clotting factors basically trigger the conversion of enzymes which again are proteins that are floating around in your bloodstream, that are dissolved in your bloodstream, and they're in their inactive form. So the first one that gets converted is an enzyme called prothrombin. Prothrombin is the inactive form. The clotting factors help convert it to the active form, which is called thrombin. And then thrombin, in turn, basically, as we can see on the diagram here, thrombin increases the enzyme response. So basically, thrombin can also convert prothrombin to thrombin. So essentially, it can activate itself once it's converted to the active form. Thrombin also, in turn, will convert fibrinogen, which is the inactive form, to fibrin, which is the active form. And fibrin is as the name implies, very long, fibrous, filamentous protein that basically is long threads, and they wrap around the platelets, and they wrap around red blood cells and any other cellular debris in your bloodstream to help form a clot. And of course, the purpose of the clot is to essentially stop blood from leaking outside of your blood vessels. Keep it in the blood vessel, right? Now that's just stopping the flow initially, right? That's not actually healing anything. It's just basically plugging the hole, is what a clot does, so that you don't bleed to death, right? To actually heal that hole in your blood vessels, those cells in the lining of your blood vessels are going to have to go through mitosis, right? They're going to have to replace those damaged and dead cells and knit back together a whole sheet of cells that don't have a hole in them, right? So that's the healing part. This is mainly just damage control, is essentially what a blood clot is. You're trying to keep blood from leaking outside of your blood vessels, either to the outside of your body or just outside into the interstitial fluid surrounding the blood vessels themselves. So you don't have blood that's caught where it shouldn't be. So looking at this particular, I'm going to have to ask you guys a question. And looking at this particular feedback loop and knowing what you know, right, about genetics and deficiencies, I'm going to ask you guys a question about what circumstances might lead to a clotting disorder. And by clotting disorder, we basically mean a situation where an individual cannot form a clot like they should, and they're at risk of bleeding to death. So something like hemophilia, for example. Okay, so as you probably came up with in answer to the question, right? Anything that essentially that contributes to blood clot formation is a potential problem area if you don't have it, right, in terms of forming a blood clot. So for example, if you have a vitamin K deficiency or you're short on calcium, both of those act as clotting factors. And so that could make it so that your body has trouble forming a blood clot in response to an injury. If you have a low platelet count, basically your body's not making enough platelets, that's definitely something that could lead to a clotting disorder. Of course, if you have any mutations, right, in any of the genes that code for those clotting factors, right, most of those are proteins, right, so prothrombin or fibrinogen, among others. We have other clotting factors that we don't cover there, but those are the main ones. If the genes for those proteins are not functioning properly, right, then those clotting factors are either not going to be produced at all, or they're going to be produced in a way that they can't be converted to an active form that functions the way that it's supposed to, and there you have a clotting disorder as well. So blood clots should only form in response to an injury, basically a cut or something else where you have damaged blood vessels and you have blood leaking out of your blood vessels, and of course you don't want that to happen, so you need to basically plug that hole with a clot. Now, of course, the question becomes, right, we have all of those clotting factors are floating around your bloodstream all the time. Theoretically, in their inactive form, is what they should be, right, dissolved in the plasma. There are also anti-clotting factors in our plasma that help prevent clots from forming spontaneously without signals from damaged cells, right? So basically helping to prevent the conversion of prothrombin to thrombin or fibrinogen to fibrin without there being some sort of damage that they need to respond to, right? So unfortunately, sometimes though, blood clots do form where they should not form, right? So they're forming and not in response to an injury, but just spontaneously forming in your blood vessels. And this means that you have something that can potentially block the flow of blood in your blood vessels. And this is what we refer to as a thrombus. So a thrombus is a blood clot that forms where it should not form. Basically, it's forming but not in response to injury, because forming in response to injury would be appropriate. This is inappropriate blood clot formation. So obviously blocking blood flow to anywhere is going to cause damage, right? This is obviously not a good thing to have happen. But of course, the amount of damage depends on where the thrombus occurs, right? So in some people who have a tendency for blood clots to form where they're not supposed to, it can form, for example, in the capillaries and blood vessels in your legs. That would be referred to as a deep vein thrombosis, right? And that, of course, can cause damage to your muscle tissue and other things in that particular area. If the clot occurs in any of the coronary arteries, so these are the arteries that actually bring oxygen to your heart muscle and keep your heart functioning properly. That's known as a myocardial infarction or an MI. We also refer to that as a heart attack, right? This means, of course, that the blood flow, again, the muscle is cut off from oxygen supply. So this means it's going to be damaging the heart muscle itself. The heart muscle basically may start to die. Muscle tissue may start to die as a result of that. And of course, you have, if your heart is not pumping properly because of a blood clot, right? You could have other additional problems like oxygen deprivation to your brain and death and all sorts of nasty things like that as a result of this blocked blood flow. If a thrombus occurs in your lungs, we refer to it as a pulmonary embolism. An embolism is basically just something that blocks blood flow, right? And it's pulmonary in the sense that it is occurring in the either the arteries generally that are supplying your lungs with blood supply. And then, of course, is going to cut off supply to your lungs, but also means that blood is not probably coming back from your lungs that's oxygenated, and that's going to be causing all sorts of problems in your body in terms of a lack of oxygen elsewhere as well. And of course, if a blood clot occurs in your brain, anywhere in the blood vessels in your brain, we refer to that as a stroke. So again, you're cutting off oxygen supply and nutrient supply to the cells in your brain. Nerve cells in particular are very greedy for glucose and other nutrients, and of course oxygen. So other cells can probably survive longer without oxygen. Our brain cells really can't survive more than a couple of minutes with blocked blood flow. So a stroke, again, can be debilitating in terms of paralysis damage because, again, nerve signals are not being sent properly to other parts of your body. So you may, again, have paralysis, but also, again, the oxygen deprivation can be deadly as well. Now, if, for example, if you have a myocardial infarction, the typical way to resuscitate someone who's going through that is a technique called CPR, right, or cardiopulmonary resuscitation. So these are those compressions. And essentially what you're trying to do is, well, you're trying to restart the heart, but you're mostly trying to keep the blood circulating throughout the body, basically making sure that all the other cells that need oxygen are getting it. you're also breathing for them as part of that too, just keeping the blood flowing and circulating in your body until you can restart the heart muscle, which again can be through the use of electric shock, for example. So using those paddles that we've all seen on different television shows and whatnot to create electrical flow that passes through the heart muscle and essentially restores the synchronized beat and that nervous impulse that leads to synchronous beating of the heart muscle. And dealing with the clot, the only thing we have right now to deal with a clot that has already formed is a treatment called TPA, which stands for tissue plasminogen activator. And this is basically a specialized protein that dissolves blood clots that have already formed. But we only have that one tool, and timing is also important with this. So the longer the clot is formed, the less responsive it is to TPA. So really, if you need to get somebody who's had an MI, medical attention immediately, because assuming that the MI is a result of a clot, which it is not always, but quite often it is. They may be able to dissolve the clot and restore blood flow without having to do surgery or something like that. So someone who has either had a heart attack already or has risk factors for heart attack, such as high blood pressure, which leads to damage in the arteries, which can lead to a thrombus forming as a result of when the plaque ruptures there, as we're going to talk about in just a second. Other risk factors for having a heart attack, they may be prescribed something to prevent blood clots from forming in the first place. So because of course we only have one tool to break up existing clots. So the key to preventing a heart attack is preventing thrombuses, thrombi, from forming in the first place, right? Now, of course, you can imagine, well, what happens if I actually get injured, right? If I have an injury and I'm on some sort of medication, right, that is interfering with blood clot formation, basically preventing blood clots from forming, isn't that going to increase my risk of bleeding to death, right? And the answer is yes. So anticoagulants like heparin, warfarin, or Coumadin are extremely strong, and so they're not something you're going to be able to get over the counter, and most doctors are not going to prescribe it as a first-line treatment anyway. These are for folks, for example, who have congestive heart disease, and so whose risk of having a blood clot form where it's not supposed to and end up with a fatal heart attack, stroke, or pulmonary embolism, their risk for having that happen is really high. And so that warrants being on a stronger anticoagulant. So something that is going to, again, interfere with blood clot formation, and they're going to be monitoring that person like a hawk to make sure that they're not having any bleeding problems. Again, if they're bruising, anything like that, any injuries, you need to go see your doctor and make sure that you don't have internal bleeding from something like that, because you're on a very strong anticoagulant. Something to bear in mind, and this is information that's going to be very helpful for your drug interactions assignment, is the function of different types of pain relievers in the blood clotting process. So you might be thinking, well, it's a pain reliever, right? What does that have to do with blood clotting? So we have two main types of pain relievers. You have pain relievers that target the pain receptors in your brain. Those generally are narcotics, not always, but in a lot of cases. And so they are basically chemicals that mimic our natural endorphins, basically our natural brain chemicals that are regulating the pain response and helping us to deal with intense or chronic pain. Then you have basically pain receptors that are at the source of the injury or whatever is causing the pain in the first place. And these are often basically local hormones called prostaglandins. And so a lot of pain relievers actually block prostaglandin function. So essentially your brain doesn't get the signal that is in pain in the first place because the pain is being dealt with at the source. Another way that these pain relievers function also that has to do again with the way that they work in terms of not only pain relief, but many of them also are anti-inflammatory drugs. And so they basically, by blocking prostaglandins, that helps to prevent inflammation from occurring as well. These drugs also often interfere with the clumping of platelets as response to the release of clotting factors. So this means that you can have an injury and your body does not form a clot the way that it's supposed to, or it takes longer for a blood clot to form, which is typically what happens. It's not necessarily blocking it completely. You don't end up with hemophilia from taking a leave, right? But it can take longer for your body to form a clot in response to an injury. These chemicals, except for aspirin, however, because of how they function, they can also accidentally trigger that enzyme cascade that we were looking at earlier, right? Where one enzyme triggers another enzyme and triggers another enzyme, right? So the downside to something like that is, well, two. One, of course, is you have any mutations in the enzymes involved, and you may end up with a clotting disorder, meaning your body doesn't form a clot in response to an injury the way that it should. You also have multiple steps in that process, and so if something goes wrong at any of those steps, you can have a problem. So for example, if you have, again, these particular drugs that accidentally, for example, trigger fibrinogen into fibrin or prothrombin into thrombin, they can trigger a clot to form, a thrombus to form, where there is no injury, just as a byproduct of how the drugs function. They can accidentally trigger these enzyme cascades, and that, of course, is why if you look at your bottle of of ibuprofen or whatever it is that you have, that you're taking for a headache or menstrual pain or a pulled muscle, whatever it is, and you look at the bottle, it's going to have a warning on it that it can increase your risk of bleeding, especially in the lining of your stomach and other places. Don't take it if you're already on another blood thinner, right? Like, again, heparin or warfarin or Coumadin, without consulting with your doctor. So in addition to the bleeding warnings and the clotting blockage warning, you're also going to see a warning on there that it can increase your risk of heart attack or stroke. And that's the result of this accidental triggering of that enzyme cascade by these particular NSAIDs, or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Again, aspirin is the exception. Aspirin does not trigger the enzyme cascade, but these others can possibly have that happen. So obviously you don't want to be taking this and a blood thinner together is going to significantly increase your bleeding risk. So any tiny injury inside, you can end up bleeding to death. So if you are on a blood thinner, right, what do you do if you're in pain? Well, you have an option, and it's called Tylenol. Also known as acetaminophen is the active ingredient in Tylenol. And acetaminophen is not an NSAID. It is a pain reducer and a fever reducer, but it's not an anti-inflammatory. So there are, of course, risks to taking Tylenol long-term, but results of liver damage and other things. But you have an option, for example, if you're on a blood thinner and you have a headache or something like that, or you're running a fever, you have an option for dealing with that that's not going to increase your bleeding risk. Okay, so other types of damage to our arteries can involve the buildup of fatty deposits on those arteries. These are deposits that often take decades to accumulate. Most of the deposits are cholesterol, which of course is why we tend to monitor our cholesterol, especially as we get older. But they also will test for that in younger folks as well. So these buildup of fatty deposits on the arteries cause basically the walls of the arteries to become stiff, and they don't respond, they don't stretch like they normally should. So this is what's known as atherosclerosis or arteriosclerosis, depending on how you pronounce it. There is no extra R in there. So normal artery function, especially your aorta and other arteries, around your heart, when the ventricles contract, they are pushing blood from your heart into your arteries, and that increases the pressure in the arteries, and so in response to that, your arteries essentially bulge out a little bit. The arteries actually, the lining of the muscles allows them to expand in response to that pressure change, and that's normal for them. If you have a lot of extra pressure on your arteries over prolonged periods of time, meaning that you're putting extra stress on your arteries as a result of high blood pressure, that's going to cause them to be expanding more than they normally do, and it can stretch and damage the lining of your arteries. And so your body's response to that is typically to lay down lipids. I'm not quite sure why your body responds that way, but that's how our immune system responds to damage in our arteries, is essentially covering over the damaged area with lipids. And they use different kinds of lipids, but one component, of course, is cholesterol. Now, we have two main types of cholesterol in our bloodstream, and they have different jobs. LDLs are our low-density lipoproteins, and that makes it sound like that's the good kind of cholesterol, but it's actually not, right? Low density is actually the bad guy. It takes cholesterol to cells, so it's shuttling cholesterol around your bloodstream. So if you have a lot of that, that's more cholesterol that's likely to be attracted to these lipid reinforced areas in your arteries, and it tends to build up over time. The HDL, the high density lipoproteins, these are the good guys. So these are the type of cholesterol that is looking for essentially excess cholesterol in your bloodstream. HDL basically helps eliminate LDL cholesterol and takes it to the liver for processing and elimination. So what's important, of course, when you're looking to have your cholesterol checked, your overall number, basically how much cholesterol concentration you have, is important. But more important than that is the ratio of LDL to HDL. So you want to have basically more HDL and less LDL cholesterol in your body if you want to help prevent the risk of further damage to your arteries, or just prevent arteriosclerosis from happening in the first place. So as I was mentioning, response of our body to recurring damage to our arteries, of course, is to lay down these lipids, which again tends to attract any cholesterol that's in our bloodstream to that particular location. So over time, and again, this tends to take quite a bit of time. We're talking maybe a couple of decades for this to happen, where the plaque, this fatty deposit, builds up to the point where not only is it making the walls of your arteries stiffer, so they're less able to respond to changes in blood pressure, but it's restricting the blood flow, right? Because you can see on the image here, the plaque is basically thickening on the sides of the artery, and basically that's making it less space for blood flow to happen. And of course, if it gets to be too much, you have blood that's going through at tremendous pressure, but maybe only able to go through one red blood cell at a time if it's that restricted. And of course, if you have something like that, then you are increased risk for enough pressure to actually cause that plaque to essentially burst or rupture. And of course, that can cause the walls of your arteries to rupture, or any damage can cause a thrombus to form. And so you may have a blood clot is forming and basically blocking the blood flow completely because it's getting trapped in this narrow area by the plaque along the lining of the arteries. So again, if the plaque ruptures, right, you can have a thrombus forming and completely blocking the blood flow. So there's a couple of ways that we can deal with this situation surgically. In the past, they've performed and it still happens for folks who don't have other options, called a bypass surgery, where you essentially are replacing the damaged section of artery and reconnecting the other undamaged ends together. The other alternative is what's called a stent, and this is essentially putting in it used to be, I believe they used to use metal, but I think that now they're using other polymers that are a little bit more flexible. But you want something also that's going to be stiff as well. You're going to need essentially the stent basically props the artery open and restores blood flow and allows the blood to flow the way that it should. So you don't want your stent to collapse back on itself, but it also needs to be somewhat flexible to be able to respond to changes in blood pressure. And so the stent basically is a permanent addition to your artery. Again, sometimes they fail and they collapse down, and you essentially have what is like a heart attack without the blood clot situation. So again, someone who has had this happen and they've had a stent put in, generally they are going to be put on blood thinners, right? Something that's going to prevent clots from forming, because you don't need a clot anywhere in this particular area, even though you have restored the blood flow. You want to make sure that that's never going to happen again for that particular person. So for someone who has had either an MI as a result of a blood clot forming and blocking their arteries, or has experienced chronic pain, angina as a result of having blocked, or I should say arteries that are mostly blocked. Typically, again, putting a stent in or performing bypass surgery, and again, putting that person on a regimen of an anti-inflammatory drug. The go-to drug to begin with is usually aspirin, mainly because it has the blood thinning properties without the downside of accidentally triggering, right, an enzyme cascade. You don't want to put them on something where you could actually end up triggering a blood clot to form when you're trying to prevent them in the first place, right? Something else that they also may look at are your cholesterol count, but also the ratio of high to low. And if your ratio is off, they may prescribe diet changes, but also will probably prescribe a medication called a statin. And the assignment actually that I've asked you guys to complete asks you to look up the properties on one of the possible different statins. There's several out there on the market. They function in different ways. Some of them block LDL cholesterol formation, and some operate in different ways. But the whole goal there is to lower the amount of LDL that's in your bloodstream, and then help prevent atherosclerosis from happening in the first place. And of course, telling folks to manage their stress. So and it's something we're going to talk about later on when we talk about our body's response to stress when we get to the endocrine system. We have an acute stress response, that's our fight or flight response, and then you have a long-term stress response, and that, as a result of how your hormones work and which systems get triggered, can lead to chronic high blood pressure, or what's known as hypertension. So this means that even when you're resting, your blood pressure is higher than it should be, meaning that every time your heart contracts, right, the heart muscles contract, they're putting more pressure on the lining of your arteries and damaging them potentially over time, which of course is going to lead to plaque formation, and that's going to increase your risk of heart attack. So there's a really, really good reason why we tell folks, especially folks at your age and a little bit older, to manage their stress and find a way to avoid chronic high blood pressure. Basically, bring your stress down so that you don't have it triggering these other pathways. Yeah, my father-in-law actually is sort of the poster child for this. He had a very high stress job for 30 years and ended up one day had some chest pain. And thankfully took it seriously and went into the doctor, and they did a stress test on his heart, and they said, oh, did you know that you have one coronary artery is 95% occluded, basically 95% blocked by plaque formation? He had another one that was 75% blocked. So that's where the pain was coming from, and so that what they did was put in stents in both of his arteries and put him on a statin, and he's on aspirin regimen, and thankfully he's perfectly fine, you know, a decade or more later. So it's something you can treat, but preventing it in the first place is a whole lot easier.